Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at Progressive Era politics. The Progressive Era, as we've established, was a time where people were trying to fix the corruption that existed because of the Gilded Age. And we've seen already how society was attempting to fix social problems. Now it's time to take a look at how the goal was to fix political problems. So let's get started. We see a couple of big amendments to the Constitution start happening pretty quickly in the 19-teens. The first one happens in 1913. It's the 16th Amendment, and it said that the federal government could collect income taxes. Now, this was met with a lot of initial pushback. The way taxes were paid prior to this point was at the beginning of the calendar year, you had until mid-April to just pay the collective tax on how much you made last year. But as you can imagine, there was definitely a lot of ways to cheat this system, and if you could, you did. The 16th Amendment started the collection of taxes much more frequently, and that's where we have the modern income tax systems that exist. The 17th Amendment was much more of a progressive era creation, and it said that states could directly elect senators. Prior to this point, if you wanted to be a senator, a member of the House of Representatives had to put your name forward. And this very quickly became an old boys club, a nepotism scheme, a you do this, I'll give you that, I'll donate $1 million to your campaign, you make me a senator. That kind of stuff happened very frequently. The 17th Amendment cleared all that up so that if you want to run for Senate, then you can just run as you are. September 6, 1901, President McKinley is shot in Buffalo, New York. 8 days after being shot, he dies, and his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, comes to power. Now, we've talked about Roosevelt a lot prior to this point. He had a huge background. He grew up wealthy. He goes to Harvard. He served on the New York Assembly. He was commissioner of New York City. He was head of the police force. He was head of the Navy. He was head of the state of New York for a while. He had tons of territory in the Dakotas. He was a colonel in the Spanish-American War. He was a written and very good historian. So by the time he comes to office, he's already done more than most individuals would for their life. And again, he's only 42. He is loyal to the Republican Party, but he's not a conservative. He is really energetic. He believes that the best thing to do is to just take the action. Roosevelt always said the best thing to do is make the right decision. The worst thing to do is make the wrong decision. And the absolute worst thing is to make no decision at all. He was willing to act on his own. He would use executive power and executive authority to get stuff done, and in some cases circumvent Congress in doing so. And this was definitely one of those, whoa, wait a minute things. But when you consider that he took control of these big giant corporations, the giant trusts, the monopolies, he gave more power to the Interstate Commerce Commission. He created the national park system that we now have today. It's kind of easy to look at all those things and say, okay, those are all very good things that came out. Roosevelt believed the biggest problem facing the country was the monopoly systems. And he wanted to fix this, but he didn't want to just take out entire industries. Instead, he wanted to regulate the systems. And what he starts doing first, and this is a year in office, he orders the Justice Department to sue Northern Securities. And this was the banking institute that included J.P. Morgan. So you've got the president going after one of the wealthiest banking firms that existed. And for 2 years, JP Morgan and Northern Security tried to work out around this suit, tried to circumvent this suit. Ultimately, though, it was handed down by the Supreme Court that said you're either going to break up Northern Securities or you're all going to jail. So they did. Roosevelt then says the same thing to the meat packers industry and Standard Oil and American Tobacco. And this had huge impacts. These are monopolies that controlled billions of dollars in a time where nations didn't control that much money. It's not just breaking up trusts he's doing. He's also willing to stand with the common man. In June of 1902, the United Mine Workers led a strike, and they wanted pretty simple stuff, an 8-hour workday, and for management to recognize that their union was a legitimate union. The owners, when these guys struck, the owners just closed the mine. The miners weren't getting paid, and the owners thought that in very short amount of time, these people are going to give up and go back to work because they're going to need food, they're going to need money, they're going to need support. But the strike didn't immediately end. It kept going through the summer and into the fall. In the early 20th century, coal was the resource that's used to heat homes, to cook food. So as autumn approached and things start getting cold, there's a big demand for this stuff. And with mines closed, you only have a finite amount of this resource. In October, Roosevelt pulls both the owners of the mines and the workers together, sits them down and says, you guys have got to come up with an agreement because we are facing a national coal shortage. The owners were very upset that Roosevelt did not immediately side with them, and they just walk out. Roosevelt responds by saying if there's not an agreement that is reached by these two sides, then he would use eminent domain to just seize the mines and have federal soldiers go in and work the mines. For the owners of the mine, this is worst case scenario. And he is really threatening it. And with everything he's done by now, you could pretty much guarantee he was probably going to do that. In March of the next year, the miners ultimately give in, say, okay, we'll open the mines, we'll talk this out. It takes about 6 months for a real deal to be met. The miners got a raise of 10%. They wanted an 8-hour day. They wanted to go from 10 hours to 8. They got 9. So it was definitely a compromise, but it worked. And it showed that Roosevelt was willing to back the little guy, not big business again. As the years went into him, Roosevelt is getting more and more liberal. He's worried that natural resources are a finite thing, and they are, so he creates the national parks. To control the stock market, he gets the ability to control how much money banks can have on hand, and even goes to acquire and break up the steel and coal industries in Tennessee. At the end of his first presidency, Roosevelt decides not to run again. He had come into office because McKinley was shot, said, I don't need to be president unless I'm elected by the people. He supports his Secretary of War, which we now call the Secretary of State, William Howard Taft, and Taft will become president. Taft was another guy who had a huge history as a politician. He had been a federal judge, a lawyer, solicitor general. He had been a civil governor of the Philippine Islands, and then he becomes Secretary of War. He really supported what Roosevelt did, and Taft carried forth a lot of the same stuff that Roosevelt did. He kept the Sherman Antitrust Act going. He wanted to expand the forest and the park systems. He approves 8-hour workdays for all people who are government contractors and passes numerous mine safety legislations. He got Congress called in on a couple different special sessions to reduce tariffs. But unlike Roosevelt, Taft would not circumvent Congress. He wanted to work with this system. Roosevelt was a close friend of a man named Pinochet who Taft fired, and this was a state federal job. Roosevelt felt that wasn't right, that wasn't fair, and in 1910, Roosevelt comes back to the States after going to Africa and going on a huge big game hunt, and he believes that Taft is not the right guy for the job. Taft was good for a while, but he's not doing what he needs to do, so he wants to become president again. Roosevelt says he's going to run for office. And this is pretty huge. The Republican Party does not immediately endorse Roosevelt. And as he runs and he's getting lots of people's attention, he is not getting the Republican support he kind of needs. So he just creates a third party, the Bull Moose Party, and he runs on that ticket. And in 1912, at election time, you've got the incumbent President Taft on the Republican ticket, the former President Roosevelt on the Bull Moose Party ticket, and then you've got this third guy, Woodrow Wilson, on the Democratic ticket. And the fact that you've got the Republican vote so split between these two men divides the votes between them. And in the end, neither one of them becomes president. And the man who does become president was Woodrow Wilson, a man who, up until this point, is not really considered going to be the one to win. He had a lot of good stuff going on for him, but he just was not Taft, he was not Roosevelt, he just wasn't. The Federal Reserve Act will be created at this time as well, and the role of the Federal Reserve Act says that the nation could create a central banking system. It divided the nation into 12 different banking districts, and each one of those districts had a local Federal Reserve Bank. The purpose of this was that you could divide up the amount of money that was in the nation a little easier. You could control the amount of money that's out there and the amount of gold that's out there. All of this would report back to the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., and ultimately the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank controlled inflation a little bit better. Okay, back to Wilson. He was more reactionary to the role of race relations. He didn't like bringing in people from out of the United States. He dismissed what Native Americans wanted and dismissed their problems. He believed they were inferior. And for Native Americans, the Dawes-Civality Act, which we talked about in the Gilded Age, is finally coming to a close. And the new acts that are going to exist are going to make it easier for Native Americans to sell the land that they now have. And the goal of all this was to, as Dawes was, quote unquote, educate Native American children in proper civilized society. It didn't work the way that everyone thought, and things continue to just spiral around for Native Americans. Populist efforts to unite folks in the South were kind of mixed. Segregation had been made the law because of Plessy v. Ferguson. It said that you could segregate people based on race just so long as there is separate but equal options. The reaction to 1,100 people being lynched in 1901, and as bad as segregation was the creation of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And this group had the very large goal of eradicating racial discrimination. Initially, this group was predominantly white, but after 1909, we see that the African American leadership that steps in takes total control of the organization itself. And one of the first principal individuals in this group is going to be W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the first African American to earn a PhD in history. He was the first African American to earn a PhD, period. He got this degree from Harvard, and Du Bois believed that African Americans needed to create their own businesses, create their own newspapers, create their own colleges, make their own cultural impact, and make it theirs, not to amalgamate to white society, not to change for the whole of the nation, but to make something that was special. So, today we've taken a look at the progressive era, how it dealt with politics, how it dealt with economics, and how it dealt with race. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.